Hello and welcome again to AI Ramblings, episode 16. We're here mid-August, but it doesn't feel like mid-August. It just feels like amazing flow of things just continues
Yeah.
when AI is concerned. And we have a number of things that we want to kind of go through today. So much to choose from. And it's always a tough exercise, which one or two news items we want to focus on. But I thought, Neil, you and I were talking about this offline. One of the big ones is, just a continuation from last week where OpenAI finally introduced GPT-5, big leader in large language models. So the world's paying attention. This week, we saw a little bit of a retracement of the simplification that they did on GPT-5, which was instead of having to select from 6, 7, 8 models, the model basically did all the work and picked the model that would respond to you from the collection of OpenAI models. Well, they got a lot of feedback, I would say, kindly, from
From consumer.
consumers, from developers, businesses. And long story short is they had a bit of a retracement. They tweaked it. And Sam Altman yesterday, I had a big post on it, which I actually had to redo. So please do look at that. There's a lot of details and links on the minutia of what happened, but it's all interesting and important to understand for a bunch of reasons I'll talk about later. But the core thing was that they reintroduced 3 categories that you had to pick from in ChatGPT 5. So auto, fast, and thinking. And that then routes the query. I talked last week about how people were already hacking it by using the word thinking instead of going into the reasoning piece, etc. And so it's interesting because this is almost like a mini version. You're too young for this. There was a very famous marketing thing a few decades ago when Coke introduced a new Coke and there was a backlash. And all of a sudden they had to rethink and rework this. And they literally it was called New Coke. And they had to bring back Coke Classic.
Yeah.
And then the new Coke became Diet Coke. Anyway, so it's just this, new products have teething problems. You have to grind your way through it. And that's what the company is doing. All of this is important, particularly because they're OpenAI. So everyone watches them and everyone is going to emulate some of this stuff. And so that one was one of the big news of the week. I don't know if you've got observations from your point of view.
Yeah,
But it's been certainly fun to watch this.
it has been. It just kind of shows that a lot of this stuff is happening, in real time. And I'm happy at least that OpenAI and Sam especially have been active in taking user feedback and also iterating on the product live in front of everyone. I think there's a couple other companies that maybe would have taken a different approach and maybe would have postponed a lot of the changes for a different update. But I've been using GPT-5 a bit, and it is something that you notice. I would ask a lot of like simple queries, and you would see the model trying to take time. They've changed the animation to where now it says, I'm thinking, and it walks you through what it's thinking about, which is obviously a way for also to compute and kind of give an animation to let the user know what's happening and kind of disguise the fact that there's a lot of compute behind this. Recently I switched over, and this is something I actually haven't brought up before, but I switched over to the desktop app for ChatGPT just this past week, ever since GPT-5 released on Mac. So I'm not actually going to a browser anymore. I'm actually using a separate standalone app.
Why?
Yeah, the reason is for a few things. Number one, they've added this thing called Works With, these kind of connectors that they've added with this new update, which allows you to connect ChatGPT to a variety of, at this point, it's just text-based apps. So Apple Notes, Notion, and then a couple of IDEs to edit code. And those are not available if you were using the desktop version. If you were using the web version. On the web version, apps that you were able to connect with were things like Box and Drive, web-only apps, if you will. So one thing from a UI UX perspective, obviously, it would be great for both of these things to be merged into one interface. So I don't have to go to web for web apps and desktop for desktop apps. But the reason I switched over is because, from my experience, ChatGPT has one of the best voice models. And whenever I'm talking to it, trying to get questions without having to type, I kind of went into this whole connectors and works with thing with maybe too high of expectations, but a glimpse into hopefully where the future of this would go is where, I connected to Apple Notes and to Notion specifically. And Notion's an app that I've spent time trying to learn, and it is a very complex power user app where, if you really get to know the ins and outs of it, it's very helpful. But if you're just kind of using it for basic notes, may be a bit confusing to people. And the reason I wanted to connect it and use it in this way was because I hoped that I could kind of talk to the voice model to explain what I want done, and it would hopefully do it for me on Notion. I was obviously asking for too much because right now all it can do is just see the context of what's on the screen and help summarize and pull queries off of the text that it already sees. But it's kind of a glimpse into where hopefully a lot of this stuff goes from a UI UX and voice point of view, which is kind of what we've talked about, with voice being this next frontier after touch, especially in the AI world. But yeah, so that's kind of one habit that I wanted to highlight, and hopefully over time it'll improve.
No, I think that's a terrific point, and it's a topic that will continue to be important to delve into as these products evolve. Because today it's about the bigger models and the voice modality that we're also going to talk about a little bit later. But also the connectivity piece is a key piece. I'm glad that OpenAI is offering this, even if it's on the website, to connect it to Google stuff and Apple stuff and so on. And that is running ahead of an issue that as they compete with Google and Apple, especially because those are the two big gorillas, they have the easier task of connecting
Yeah.
models to stuff. And so this is the next battleground. So I think that's a good one. And then the last point, we talked about this last week, is that part of this retweaking also affects the variable costs of running the compute, because we're in a compute scarce world. And that's a big underlying thing that we should keep in mind on this topic and a number of other topics we're going to talk about, is that for the next 2 or 3 years, we're in a compute constrained, supply constrained world. NVIDIA is the big beneficiary of this. And that is a constant issue here, which brings us to the notion, both these topics of connectivity to things and the compute intensity piece brings us to our second news item of the week, which is basically, I would call them PR stunts by two pretty good founders. One is Arvind of Perplexity, who put out, we've been talking about AI browsers for a long time on this show. He has one of the few browsers out there called Comet that's, you can try and understand where AI browsers are going. OpenAI is going to have its own browser soon, which, I'm sure they'll announce in the next little bit here. Google is doing a lot of stuff on Chrome on AI. Anyway, long story short is Arvind said, because there's a big court case coming up where the judge is going to decide whether Google will have to spit out Chrome, which would be detrimental to Google's business. And Perplexity basically said, "Oh, we're worth about 18 billion in the marketplace. We're going to bid 34 billion for Chrome. Judge, please give us a shot at potentially buying that." No chance that anything like that would happen. But it gets him into the news cycle. It gets his product noticed. People download it. He's a number two, AI major company trying to get into the number one status, and this is a way to do this. And in today's world of global attention, social media, memes, this is a way to get attention. That is, every founder, CEO, knows this, and they leverage this. And one thing from Perplexity, a similar move to obviously the master of social media. He owns the biggest platform out there with over 200 million followers just for him, is Elon Musk. And he used his platform to punch both Apple and OpenAI because they have a partnership. And he's now saying, oh, Apple is playing favorites by putting ChatGPT, and ChatGPT happens to be the number one app, and Grok is, not in the top apps. Maybe I'll sue them, and maybe I'll do this. And, he, guess what? He got a lot of traditional media time. He got a lot of news cycles and debates. And, I couldn't turn on CNBC without watching some pundit come on and say, oh, yeah, but, this may have merit. And so it gets discussion. And it's a bit silly. It's a bit frustrating because, the App Store and the markets in general are pretty fair marketplaces. I kind of have studied this and analyzed this for a long time. And it is what it is. But that was a big news cycle driver this week, and we've got lots of links on all of this in the show notes, so for people to look at more. It's I don't know, Neil. I mean, do you find this becoming, when these kinds of things hit, as a topic of conversation in your circles?
I mean, as much of not maybe not as much as in my circles, but it is like a trend that's obviously been happening for the last few years. That when I was growing up, a lot of these companies would just issue new information through a press release or a presentation, and now a lot of these founders and CEOs are on social media where they're quickly able to kind of dictate the dialogue and the whole discourse being held around what's happening themselves. And obviously, Elon is no stranger to this. I mean that's like the whole virality piece of it. We brought him up a couple times, but even companies like Cluely, who are almost solely based on virality, that's their whole strategy to kind of get people's attention and also acquire users. That stuff doesn't exist without the role that social media plays every day now. So as far as the Elon thing, obviously it's a way for him to complain, but also get attention towards Grok because there has been a lot of bad press recently that we've discussed surrounding it, and obviously Sam and OpenAI are having a pretty good moment right now with ChatGPT and all the advances that they've been making. So it's something that doesn't surprise me, and we'll see a lot more of it. But yeah, it's definitely a shift in the way that these things are being talked about.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's a performance skill for all these founder CEOs and a performance art,
Yes.
which also then leads us to especially some of the topics we've been discussing here. Our main topic of the week, and we both you and I have been fascinated by voice devices, especially with the legacy ones with hundreds of millions of users into the billions. If you're looking at the product from Amazon, with I'll mention the name once and then call it the A company. So, which they have an AI revamped version, which is just this week being available to reviewers, and so there were a bunch of reviews of it, and generally positive. You need an Amazon device with a screen to get the most out of it, called the Show. I did a big piece on this, but the point here is that this Alexa launch of Plus, which is free to Prime users, otherwise it's $20 a month for as a subscription. So obviously it's trying to sell Prime, Amazon Prime. It has teething problems. There are issues, and the reviewer gives a plus and a minus. Kevin Roos, he does a good job. And actually, at this point, he says he would not recommend it. And it's worth kind of understanding. These are evolutionary revamps, and it's interesting to understand what the issues are: hardware, software, culture issue. The running big organizations to make these massive changes. And there's a similar thing going on the Apple front, which was also in the news. And I did a post on this as well, where with Siri, they've got a big AI revamp. There's been a big brouhaha about Apple being behind on AI, especially on Siri. They've had to take a couple of steps back, and they're going to be launching this fairly soon, likely in the fall when the new iPhones are out, etc., in September. And again, here, what's interesting is they're using this technology called App Intense, which is a lighter way to leverage apps across on a bottom-up basis on the app ecosystem on Apple, which is 2.5 billion users of iPhones and Macs and iPads and things. But it allows developers to build much more creative experiences with AI around this theoretically. And they're trying to build that into Siri, a little bit in partnership with OpenAI. But Apple has also been clear that they are open to working with Google and other AI companies on some of this. So it's a pretty big set of ongoing work that's going on, but it's in the news because of some of these elements that I just talked about. And again, an evolutionary path that is going on here. I'm excited to try all this as it rolls out.
Yeah, I mean, this also kind of goes into the point that I brought up a few minutes ago, and it's also something that has to do with the privacy piece that I recently wrote about, where a lot of these voice models and ecosystem based platforms like Apple, like what Perplexity was trying to do with their browser, where it requires permissions, and even with things like the connectors that ChatGPT recently added, it requires permissions to be able to monitor not only your screen at times, but specific apps and the text of what goes on there, because the real value is in the context of what you're looking at, so that people don't have to go and copy and paste and wait for a response. And obviously, there's a spectrum with this. Apple, I would say, in my opinion, is on the safer side, where I would definitely trust them with App Intents to have access to whatever I'm looking at on my screen, and I can get Siri to kind of give me insights that I maybe wouldn't give to a Meta or a lot of these other a lot of these other models out there. So it's something to keep in mind. Also, the privacy piece in this, and because it is kind of a almost intrusive technology to a lot of people, because how are these models getting to know what's going on there? They're looking at your screen at all times. With things like App Intense, it'll be interesting to see how Apple educates, and I think something that needs to be talked about also is the role that these companies take to educate people on what's actually happening, because I think through science fiction and whatnot. We've talked about this for a while, but the overall sentiment about AI is that it's evil, that it's going to be our overlords eventually. And I think a lot of the role that Apple and these incumbents need to play is to educate the world on how these things are working, so that there's maybe an ease of mind whenever they're actually considering to switch over to these new technologies.
I think that trial trust thing, you totally put your finger on it. I would recommend people go read Neil's post on that. It's very well articulated, and it's going to be an ever expanding issue as we move forward. And all these companies are going to have a better answer for some of these challenges to scale this. So though that is our main topic, I think there's a lot more information if people want in the links. We really do put a lot of work on the informational links because they're literally well thought out pieces by bunch of other people, etc., that we think add color to what we're talking about. This show, Rambling, is really about bringing attention to some of the issues at a high level, broad level. But we would again highlight people interested to dig into some of the additional material. Which brings us to our next segment, which is our exciting watch or read item of the week.
Yeah.
And Neil, I love what you had, so I don't want to give away too much, but I thought it was just off the charts cool.
Yeah, so my read of the week, since we're going to start with that, is the past few episodes we've been talking about how AI and whatnot are affecting people of my age, Gen Z, people in high school and college, and how there's this like growing fear that cognitive ability is declining, and there's a overarching reliance on these models. So I wanted to kind of add a piece that I recently read in the New York Times that balances out maybe a bit of this discussion, and it's about how older people are reaping the brain benefits from new tech. And it's a good in-depth piece, and it includes a couple of studies that they did, but it essentially shows that people that are a bit older, that are interacting with technology, studies have shown that their cognitive ability is not only increasing, but them having to learn how to use these new technologies is keeping them a bit more nimble in their everyday activities. So it's not as much of a discussion piece as much as it is like a stats piece where they've done a lot of good tests and studies, and I think it was just important to kind of highlight that, since, as I said, we've been kind of doom and gloom about how these things are affecting people of my age. We can't read, our attention spans are shrinking. I
You're
think
filled with AI slop.
exactly. So I think it's good to highlight that at least someone is benefiting from this, and it's older people right now.
I thought that's why I love the piece, because it's so counterintuitive to the narrative of AI. And I always like to say, be an optimist, look at the glass half full versus the empty. Both are valid. Every technology has dual use. All fire is good and bad. Same thing here. And this is a lot of goodness coming out of this. If my parents or your grandparents were still alive, we often talked about how to engage them as they got into their 80s and 90s and so on. And my mom was just like, she loved this kind of stuff, right? So we have a personal connection to this, as we all do, and so I love where this is coming for older people and for everybody for that matter. And this counterintuitive notion is actually also applies to my read of the week. There was an article which I will have in the show notes, where it actually said because of AI, companies are going back to in-person job interviews, which I thought was just very interesting. Now, when I got my job at 22 at Goldman, I remember, it was one of the most stressful things because I had to go to New York a couple of times from North Carolina and have meetings all day with Goldman people, from junior people to the most senior people, probably a dozen interviews each time, so 24 plus. And then so that's how Goldman did their interviewing, and this was one of the best investment banking firms in the world. So that was the best job practice, and we moved away from that over the last 20-30 years because technology helped us recruit better. Today, the majority of the resumes are scanned by software and this and that, and there's been a lot of back and forth on this with the technology, especially AI, which is talked about in the article. And as a result, to get around this, companies saying, hey, you know what? We'll just bring back our in-person job interviews, which I love. Sometimes technology doesn't have to do it all. And the counter effect of this is as healthy and good and positive as anything else. So I applaud this, and it was great. I also put up a book that relates to this, which is the broader. There's a broader book that Bill Gates talked about that was written by the AI chief at Microsoft, Mustafa Suleyman, on the impact of AI on society. And one of the big topics he talks about is jobs. So that's just context if people want more stuff to read on this topic. I think both our read of the week kind of talk about the counterintuitive, glass half full aspect of AI and technology, which is very cool. Which then leads us to our next section, which I also love from you, Neil, on this one, obsession of the week. Please tell us about this.
Yes, this is also a piece from the Times titled "Hidden Inside Our Electronics: Tiny Doodles from Another Era," and it's a great piece that kind of shows how there's like this growing trend of physical hardware archaeologists. People are taking apart pieces of tech from years ago, from decades ago, and they're finding these types of, for lack of better word, Easter eggs that were left by chip designers and other hardware specialists, where they're putting tiny doodles or artifacts or drawings or their signature and names or even jokes in a lot of this tech that you can only really see if you a note what you're potentially looking for, and B, actually take the thing apart and zoom in to a microscopic scale. I mean, one of the examples that they show, it's like, they show the original piece of tech and you're like, what am I'm looking at? I don't know if there's anything here. And they zoom in, 10x. And that's when you actually see that there's a small little face embedded within the chip. And it is fun. I think it's delightful. I think it's something that maybe we lose nowadays with, a growing shift towards a software-based world where maybe physical hardware isn't as prevalent as it used to be, especially in this way. But it also kind of shifts the conversation of what does this look like in today's day and age, with things like AI, or, potentially finding small artifacts or Easter eggs that not only the engineers, but the AI itself is able to embed within things, obviously with things like image generation and whatnot. It's just fun. I think it's just a small little fun thing that, to take away from all the seriousness and world implications of AI is just a fun thing for us to kind of focus on and talk about. I thought it was cool. So
this one, I would encourage anyone to actually go to the piece, because the pictures are worth 1,000, maybe 10,000 words. It's just awesome. And the fact that you have to basically use microscopes to find out. I mean, these are Easter eggs, and the people love putting them in, and it's amazing. So absolutely highlight. It'll be interesting if AI comes up with its own Easter eggs over time. So that'll be a whole metaphysical topic to talk about at a future date. My obsession of the week, Neil, I'm sad to say, is still Cyberpunk 2077, which I've talked about before. Which is this, AAA game I've been avoiding. It's been out for 4 years. It just got available on the Mac, so I had a chance to kind of try it. I like playing on PCs, and I stopped buying gaming PCs years ago because there were time sinks and so on. But Cyberpunk 2077 is pretty fun. It reminds me of my other favorite game, Red Dead Redemption, which is done, and they have a number 2, which, oh my God, this Cyberpunk is almost as good as that. Red Dead Redemption 2, one of the best of the best. Highly recommended. And of course, Red Dead Redemption was done by Rockstar, which also did GTA 5, the biggest game of all time. And they've got GTA 6 coming out next year, so that's going to be our obsession for, I don't know, show number 222 that we'll talk about then. But the reason I'm talking about it this week as obsession, and because this is an AI rambling show, is the way I played this game this time. Because all these games have missions and hundreds of side missions, and normally I've been playing these video games for, as you know, I'm a gamer for over 30 years. Back in the 80s, you used to have to buy hint books to solve difficult problems, etc., because there was no internet, etc. And you spend 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 on this stuff. Then the internet comes along, and the last 15 years, you can get all the hints you want. And the problem is there's too much information. There's a tyranny of information. This time with Cyberpunk 2077, I ended up playing with Perplexity. We were talking about user interfaces and so on and so forth, and prompts and so on. And, for over 200 little missions, I just found just typing in the name of the mission and give me the best choices and rewards. And all of a sudden, it basically has figured out how to summarize it for me. Watch out for this. Don't miss this. Don't do this. Do this. And, instead of spending 3 hours on the damn thing, I can do it in 10 minutes. And that is very valuable to me. And that to me is my coolest use of AI that I've had in the last 2 years of large language models. I mean, of course, I've done a lot more useful things with ChatGPT and so on. But Perplexity, I think, has nailed this issue of selecting models within models, the
Yes.
UI, UX, the reasoning, etc. And sometimes you find the most serious innovations in some of the sillier applications. And so this was kind of interesting. And so between how Perplexity changed my gameplay and the game itself, that's been my new obsession of the week.
Yeah, it's something
So
I actually haven't seen talked about, and I'm sure people are doing it, and it just shows that in the end of the day, what these companies intend for these things to be used for are very different than what they actually end up getting.
these are general purpose tools. Exactly.
I'm sure billion-dollar LLM companies that can be spun up just from things like this.
Totally.
I'm sure.
So very, very cool. So that marks our show. I don't know if we typically do a burning question. Why don't we run through that quickly today? I think we have a couple of minutes. I think you had a question for me and I had a question for you. Why don't I ask my question instead? We just talked about games.
Wonderful.
You've been a gamer, you've been very, very selective. So
Yes.
what are current games in your life that you're
Yeah,
excited about?
I haven't been gaming as much as of late, but every year they've kind of hooked me for the last like 12 or 13 years. But FIFA is a game that now it's called EAFC because of various licensing issues. But essentially, it's the premier soccer game released by EA Sports every year. And people always complain that there's no new innovations and that we're just buying the same game every year for $60. But I end up doing it every year for better or for worse. And it's a game that I've been playing recently. We've had this discussion offline for a while, but for whatever reason, I haven't really gotten into as many of the story games, and things like what you've said with Perplexity helping you might actually be something to sell me on it, because a lot of times it's just that tyranny of choice that you can go in any direction as you can with life, and you really don't want to make the wrong choice when it comes to a lot of these games because you don't want to miss out on perks. So having something like a Perplexity or an LLM that can kind of help guide you through a lot of your decisions is something that might be fun. But yeah, I've been playing FIFA, and I actually have been using a couple of the AI tools to even do stuff like player tactics and whatnot, just because there's so many choices and combinations and permutations out there as to how you can line up against like players. A lot of these things that weren't available before, whenever I first started playing this 10 or so years ago, really helped me in my gameplay now. So that's kind of been a fun little thing I've been doing recently.
Awesome. Good burning question and answer.
And okay, so cool. I'll go ahead and fire mine off as well then. Mine is, we kind of touched on it a bit earlier, but with things like Notes and Notion, I wanted to know, how do you take notes every day? So what platform, and kind of what are some of your pain points? Because, I think the note space, I was talking to a friend earlier, is very fragmented right now. You have things like Apple Notes, which is the default that a lot of people like, my mom and dad go to whenever they need to jot something down. We obviously have traditionalists with papers and pens. And then, we have people that are power users with things like Notion. And I know you've been obviously an avid note taker for a while. I can already see you jostling things around over there. So I'll let you take it from there.
I love your burning question for me. As you know, this is a lifelong topic of best note taking. I'm still, despite being a total techie, I'm still totally tied to paper and pen. And you and I have had deep conversations on this. You've recommended paper, pen, as well, etc. So my first choice is still, despite all the technology I have at my fingertips, I still love paper and pen. Bad news is I have terrible handwriting. So, it's not always the ideal thing. That's why I do like gizmos that basically allow you to use software to clean up your notes, etc. So my current other go-to is my Amazon Kindle Scribe, which has a pen and write stuff. I also have iPads and all that other stuff. But in terms of the nitty-gritty of your question, I've tried everything. I mean, I've tried Notion, Notes. I not just try, I use them all, etc. But my go-to every day, meat and potatoes, the way I take notes, Apple Notes, because it works across all the platforms for the short stuff, and Google Docs for the long stuff. And with AI in particular, what I'm finding is that as we use this stuff for a lot more interesting things, the core thing I really want always is just a quick button on Gemini or on Notes that basically says, oh, I'll put it into a permanent storage thing. Because the problem with ChatGPT or Gemini or any of these interfaces is that there's this doom scrolling aspect to your results. And you never know if the dang thing actually will remember it. Today, with the voice modality, I often tell Gemini, I often tell ChatGPT, can you send me this as an email? Can you send me this as a text? Can you put it in? And to date, 2025, August, no, it can't. It'll often nicely say, I can't do that yet. And that is the next holy grail. I want this stuff to put it into whatever note-taking app I tell it to, and then allow me to then go from there to, because these, we're working with this. These are words and thoughts are a work in progress, and it needs to put it into some sort of an assembly line for us. And that is the next challenge for these technology companies. We have to stop thinking about these as apps, as hardware, as software. We have to think about it again as a system, especially when AI is basically synthesizing everything from constantly out there, not just historical, but new stuff, real time. We have to rethink note taking.
Yes.
And everything, but note taking especially. So I love this topic. It is a burning topic for me. And thank you for asking that. It's going to be a popular topic for us on AI Rambling going forward. And with that, I want to conclude our show, episode 16. This has been fun again, Neil. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. As usual, like, subscribe, comment, feedback, always welcome. And we look forward to having you again soon. And as always, stay tuned.
See you next time. Bye.